Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the August Journal Club. We have the honor of having Dr. Thomas here with us. A little bit about him. He is the director of the Motor Control Lab at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he has been a licensed physical therapist for 36 years with over 15 years of clinical experience specializing in orthopedics and lower back pain. So, over the past 24 years, he has melded his clinical experience and knowledge with his training in neuroscience to advance knowledge on trunk control and low back pain. So, he also has a strong record of funding and has been funded by the NIH since 2004. So, it's an honor to have you here, Dr. Thomas. We're so excited to hear from you. You can take it away whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me. And again, I met Garrett when he did an internship in my lab last summer. And so I look forward to, hopefully it's going to be a chat that, will raise some more questions and go from there. So let's just kick it off.
Research is about trials and sometimes errors. At a top-tier research university, you learn to manage both. Practice makes perfect, but research makes possible.
So it's always good to start a talk with a shameless plug for VCU. And so that's where we'll start there. So today's talk, I'll be going through how we harness the power of VR to shape motor behavior. And what I'll be talking about today, I'll review the process of developing VR interventions, the present results from our recently completed studies on virtual dodgeball. We'll kind of go over some of those. And present a case study in VR development. And again, what I'm hoping to do is get through this and then open things up for discussion at the end. So first things when you start thinking about VR and importance is really this construct of immersion or level of immersion. So how much presence or agency, how much do you really believe that you are that person? And you can think about it is that the level of immersion is a really important consideration if you're trying to convince people to perform or engage in certain behaviors. Now, again, remember, from the construct of rehabilitation specialists, oftentimes, and movement specialists, right? So we're going to sit there and say, we believe the individual has a movement dysfunction. We suspect that if they engage in a specific target behavior, it'll reduce disability, pain, or improve function, or some combination thereof. So the level of immersion is very important. The other issue is distraction an integral component of the intervention? So oftentimes, some of the earlier work with VR was the snow globe and essentially trying to provide a distraction for debridement during burns. The other thing that people may use in terms of distraction is essentially manipulating the environment to convince people to do a task they may not want to, which we'll get back to later on as a fundamental construct of the work I do with VR and chronic back pain. So the other issue is presentation of the avatar, and specifically whether you present the avatar in the first or third person. So right now you see a first person presentation, which is what we exist. We don't see our arm unless we look down and see it. Alternative, we could see a third person presentation where we're seeing our avatar in front of us and then we're controlling it. The question is, does that matter? Well, in terms of motor performance, what effects does avatar perspective have? And what we've found, we've done a couple different studies on this, is that avatar perspective matters. And it matters in a way that is important to me as somebody looking at individual with back pain, is that if I have somebody do the same specific gaming intervention or same task, and I present the virtual dodgeball in a first versus third person presentation, they're going to move the spine more in a first person presentation. So a large part of my work is trying to convince people with back pain to move. So presenting the avatar in a first person orientation is really quite important. Fidelity to the real world is another construct we have to think about. So starting off with spatial fidelity. So does VR space map accurately to the real world? Now, this is quite important because if I have someone working on a specific task or a motor control issue, is that I want to make sure that if they're reaching for a target 1 meter in front of them and 1 meter off the ground in VR space, that absolutely maps to precisely 1 meter off the ground and 1 meter in front of them in VR. Reason being is that when they pop the headset off, I want them to be able to have the practice actually be used in real world environments. However, does distortion of the VR space achieve our enhanced treatment specific goals? So different ways to think about this. I'll give you an orthopedic example and then a neurologic example. In an orthopedic construct, I may want individuals to perform a task with more trunk flexion. So what I could do is subtly shrink the length of the arm of the avatar. So I can scale it back just slightly to get them to engage. From a neurologic perspective, you could see someone who has a right-sided cerebral vascular accident leading to left-sided motor deficits. But the other big thing on that is you often have left-sided neglect. And if you've seen these patients, right, they'll draw a clock and only draw the right side of the clock face. So what we can do is deliberately distort the visual field to get them to engage on the left side, and then hopefully get some changes at the neurologic level. So there's ways that we could use distortion, but it has to be very treatment specific. Temporal fidelity. So real time does not exist, no matter what. There is a latency. Think about if I'm sampling motion at 100 hertz, I have a minimum of a 20 millisecond delay because I need 0.1, took me 10 milliseconds to collect, 0.2, which took me 20 milliseconds to collect, and see where my target is going. So real time does not exist. And the fact is that delays can be quite problematic. And so the inherent delay within game play can really have a negative impact. Two ways. One, in terms of motion sickness, which is a fundamental problem with VR, although it's also something that's been, ironically utilized by the Disney Corporation to enhance their park experience. And this has been since well before VR. But any of Disney's earliest rides where you were on some sort of coaster going through a tunnel and there was visual scenes placed in front of you, they calculated that if the scenes were offset about a frame or two from the actual motion characteristics, it would get most people a little bit queasy. And they wanted that because then people felt like they had their money's worth from a ride. And then as they're leaving they get off the ride and they're coming out, they get hit in the face by a cold blast of air. That cold blast of air is to try to reset the vestibular ocular system so that all of a sudden now you're not walking around with a bit of seasickness going on. Okay, so the general game development, it is an iterative process, and I like to call it the Goldilocks phenomenon. If the game, and again, when I'm talking about game in today's lecture, that's synonymous with interventions. If it's too easy, the patients get bored and they do not engage in target behavior. If it's too difficult, the patients get frustrated and do not engage in target behavior. And so the idea is, how do you find that sweet spot to get the people to perform the task that the game is designed to get them to do? All of my work is very specific in trying to shape motor behavior. And at the level of rehabilitation, that's a pretty important component, I think, and you have to figure out how to thread that needle. So what are the first steps? We got to collect the critical background information. This is what's going to inform our decision-making processes in creating the intervention. That entitles knowing what are the goals of the intervention. So in this case, I've spent a lot of work looking at the fear avoidance behavior model of back pain. And essentially, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. If someone gets an injury, they're exposed and has pain. Depending on the underlying level of catastrophizing, they have fear of movement and re-injury, so they have avoidance and hypervigilance that leads to depression, disuse, and disability. So they kind of get stuck in this cycle. Conversely, if they have low catastrophizing, they kind of circle out, they engage they're not afraid of the pain, they engage it, and they recover. So we spent a lot of time looking at this specific avoidance, and we actually had the first papers that have mapped the fear cognitions to motor behavior. And what did we find? Well, before we get there, we use these things called a standardized reaching test, which I developed during my dissertation in the mid 90s in early work. And basically, we create target locations based on an individual's hip height, trunk length, and arm length, so that in theory, they could reach a target by a certain amount of degrees if they flex the trunk 15, 30, 60 degrees with the elbow extended and the shoulder flexed to 90 and no other movement of the other joints. Now, realize that this here for the 60 degree, this is not possible. You would fall over if you moved in this manner. It is simply a mathematical construct so that I can compare or put targets in an individual's relative workspace so that I can compare folks anywhere, if they're 5'5" or 6'5", the targets that they have to reach for are in the same relative workspace so we can compare across subjects. So one of our earlier papers that we came out with, and came out in 2007, we basically found that in target reaching tasks to high, middle, and low targets, individuals with high fear moved less than individuals with low fear. Okay. This is quite important because it's not saying they didn't have the range of motion, because look, here they had 30 degrees of lumbar flexion, but even in targets that only required 15 to 20 degrees of flexion, they use less. Our targets that required only 5 degrees of trunk flexion. People with high levels of fear avoidance avoid flexing the trunk. We have found this repeatedly in individuals who have recovered from an episode of low back pain. We found it in experimental back pain, and we found it in chronic. So we found a fairly robust finding of mapping fear cognitions to motor behavior in back pain. That led to the genesis of virtual dodgeball. So this was a video game designed to promote lumbar motion amongst individuals with chronic low back pain and high levels of fear of movement. What were the advantages of the virtual dodgeball? One, it allows for dynamic lumbar flexion. We can customize it to each individual based on baseline assessments, and we can scale it across visits. Finally, it provides a fun distraction while encouraging movement. So how do we develop it? Well, we're going to take a look under the hood right now and see what we started with. Well, everything comes back to my standardized reaching task, because this is how I scale the game events so that I can encourage the type of movement that I want. So we started with dodgeball, and it's simply if we knew the distance from the intended interception point, we know the height of the launch virtual ball, we could then come up with a calculation to have a trajectory that goes through there. So we have a launch point, we have an intended interception point. Now, remember that there's two things going on. One, it's a kinematically redundant system. It means there's more degrees of freedom available in the system that are defined by the task. So there's an infinite solution set. That being said, it's also a dynamic task. So these balls are coming across, the individual can engage out here or closer back to the body. So the input variables, we had intended interception height, distance to intended interception, launch height, and initial velocity. And what we had to calculate was the launch angle to make the math work. Now, the other thing I'm going to show a couple of pictures to show, people come into the lab and say, oh, wow, this is, Garrett was in my lab last summer. It's like, oh man, everything's really great. Well, Garrett's seeing a lab, he's coming into a lab that's taken me 25 years to put together, and he's seeing the virtual reality work. This is where it began. And you can see the kind of frustrations of, we started with the 3D TV, the subject is a student of mine, her arm is straight, while the avatar is bent. So lots of collection things. As we start to get a little bit better, we start figuring out, okay, how are they moving? Are these things tracking? Are they doing what we want? This led to VR Dodgeball 1. This was played on the 3D TV. And you can see that the individual had to reach forward to the balls that are launched. And the thing that you're going to note is the avatars light up either green or red, and they light up 300 milliseconds prior to the ball being launched. This was one of those Goldilocks phenomena because the original game, the players did not actually do anything before a ball was launched. They just launched it. But you can see this was a very basic avatar and there was no motion. So when the ball was launched, the player had no idea and couldn't play the game at all successfully. So we found out we had to give about a 300 millisecond warning of which avatar was going to launch the ball. This is, again, things that we hadn't anticipated, but we learned and through iterative testing made adaptation to the game. So then, we went immediately from the VR the dodgeball playing on 3D TV with shutter goggles, and then the Oculus Rift developer kit came out, and we immediately translated to now we've gone from, as you saw before, third-person presentation to now first-person presentation, and much more immersive game. That led to our later iterations and various levels of dodgeball. And you can see now we have the avatars have full body motion and launching. The crowd actually has more individual behavior. It's more engaging for the participants. The other thing we ended up doing was creating more environments for the individuals to play in, trying to keep it exciting. So we had cannon, day, night, and then we had dodgeball that was played on like a foreign planet. So we started to develop it. So now there was aliens launching the balls, and if they hit the person, well, the aliens cheered, and then if they were successful in blocking, astronauts that are out of view here would cheer. So it was a whole sort of construct. So in developing dodgeball, we first did a feasibility, a phase 1 clinical trial, the learning study, lumbar excursion activities reinforced with novel interactive gaming. As you know, all clinical trials have to have some clever name, and I have a colleague who is now at University of South Florida, who I just call whenever I have a new trial going up, and he comes up with a great name for me. So you always got to have the right people around you. So we published this in J. Payne. It was feasibility and safety of virtual reality dodgeball intervention. And basically what we found was that lumbar flexion increased within and with across gameplay sessions, strong positive endorsement of the game, no increases in medication use, pain, disability, no adverse events. It was only a 3-day intervention. So as clinicians out there will know, with chronic back pain, you're not going to really change things in 3 days. This is basically to see whether people would engage. That led to the phase 2 randomized clinical trial on virtual dodgeball, the Vigor trial, virtual immersive gaming to optimize recovery in low back pain. It was proposed to do 230 participants with chronic back pain and high fear movement, a 9-week intervention, and post-treatment session follow-ups at 1, 6, 12, 24, and 48 weeks. Now, again, this is what we were dealing with, and then a little thing called COVID came along. So we ran this during COVID. We were still able to get 175 participants with over 4,300 laboratory testing sessions during the pandemic. It was crazy to do this. And you guys are the first people to see this tonight, but we've just done our initial analyses of the outcome. We still have a few subjects, about 6 that have to finish the final follow-ups. But overall, Vigor resulted in a 30% reduction in pain, a 31% reduction in disability, an average global impression of change at 1 year of positive 3 plus 5.5. Basically, this virtual dodgeball was very successful in reducing pain and disability, and patients really were excited about it. So we're actually putting in competitive renewal in 3 days, in which we're going to have a home version of a suite of games for chronic back pain, and they were compared to standard of care physical therapy. And I'll come back to that in a bit. What if we get beyond dodgeball? So again, while we were doing this, we started developing a suite of games and tried to deal with things that would have ability for evaluation and treatment. So on the assessment model, reachability is essentially my standardized reaching task that has been converted into a virtual reality system. It allows us to assess spine motion in a standardized reaching task. And this is the classic measure here. These are all some green screen activities that we had, and we give them some directions. We ask some questions about expectations of pain and harm. So again, the big thing is, are they afraid of doing the task? Do they expect harm? Once they rate that, the target will change color. They'll reach out and touch the target, and then come back to an up-extended posture. So that's our evaluation. That's our reachability task. Then we have a suite of treatment modules called the Mover Suite. And in this, we have matchability. In that, it's like the children's game Simon, where you have light cubes light up, two cubes and three, then four as you get better at touching them. So the player reaches the static targets at a self-selected pace. Fishality. This is where a player nets virtual fish that jump out of a lake at high parabolic flight, so nice, gentle floating. And then dodgeality, where you've seen before, it's the dodgeball where they have to intercept or duck virtual dodgeballs that are launched at a flatter trajectory at higher velocities. So what you're seeing here is the matchality. And again, the heights of the targets are based on my standardized reaching paradigm of 15, 30, 45, and 60. And if you'll notice here, he's going to play the game. So the cube's light. He's got to touch him in order. And we've used sort of a NASA-based theme here as we try to, because the game will vary depending as you go through levels. So note when they miss and make an error on this. Okay, so the behavior of the cube breaks, but it's great. It's the physics are such that it's reacting how it would in a normal gravitational sphere. Now, in the next level of this game, where they're playing at low Earth orbit, now what happens when they play the game? He doesn't know where it goes, and the spheres act because we have the gravitational set to low Earth orbit. The whole idea here is you want to believe that people are on the space shuttle sitting out on the platform looking down at Earth. So again, it seems like subtle differences, but remember, immersion and agency, presence, that all matters in how much people engage in the target behaviors. Okay. So fishality, I showed you before where we had the trajectories for dodge. In this case, we wanted to know what was the launch distance, what was the intended intercept point, but then we said, what is the max parabolic height that we want? And we can make adjustments on that. And then from there, to create the trajectories, we have two things we have to create, not a launch angle, but launch velocity. So in this case, they're sitting at a nice, gentle spot. It's a very idyllic place. And you can see it's a little bit easier. They have to go towards a moving target. So now they have to time their movements with that. But the parabolic flight is fairly low. You can see there's all kinds of detail of the fish that are in the tank. They're swimming. That little shark coming over is a little game effect that we want to keep people thinking. And so the shark sometimes scares people, but it does get them moving. And these are some crazy things that my programmers put in to kind of scare people. We don't do this with real subjects. So now here's what it seems in a first-person perspective, what the person sees from their goggles. And there's the shark is somewhat terrifying. Why a shark is like jumping out of a freshwater lake, it's sort of a play on the bad movie Lake Placid. But again, actually, this kid's done pretty well at this game. But this is fishality. People really like it. It's a more genteel version. And then dodge, you've seen this before. When we have people playing dodge, we have them playing cannon first. And cannon employs that same construct of high parabolic flight. So it's gentle slope, really easy to get to. And then you get to the next level with the launch balls. Now, as people get better, we can also adjust the velocity of the launches. And you may see that occasionally the ball will change color from red to black. The player will also hear a duck quacking, and that is their signal that they can't block the ball, they have to duck. So again, it just creates a wrinkle in the game to keep people moving. What if we go beyond pain? What if we start thinking about balance and mobility? What if we start thinking about the VR in games for as a cognitive trainer? So this is an 84-year-old female with moderate cognitive decline. These two folks happen to be related to me. They're my folks. He's 95 at the time, and we were out visiting. I was doing a lecture in Boston, and I had my equipment. They live on Cape. And here's my mother playing. I didn't tell her about the shark. And that's the kind of a first response that people get when they see the shark. So I don't win Son of the Year award for this one, but what it shows is that individuals, older individuals, will engage. Again, she's 85 at the time, I believe, and loved playing the fishing game. And as many of you'll know, there's a lot of work with Alzheimer's and impairments where if you can get people moving, you can get them to perhaps ameliorate or reduce the progression of the cognitive decline. Here's another game that we have, and this may be redundant, a cheesy casino sort of setup here. And again, this is the game concentration, where you keep flipping cards, trying to remember where specific cards were to get a match, and then they come off. A couple things you notice here, not only does she have to, find the cards and have them match, but the height of the cards are also related to her anthropometry. So 15, 30, 45, 60. So we're getting movement and we're getting work on cognition while they're doing it. So this is one more way that we can go with these games. A little bit of behind the scenes thing. This is sort of the magic where my team put together the green screen that you've seen. And so again, we have a fairly large team that works for me. So in conclusion, VR has the potential to fundamentally transform the delivery of rehabilitation treatments. As this technology rapidly evolves, the treatments can be easily customized for each patient, and that's sort of the great part. The cautionary tale is we must have a sound neurologic physiologic rationale for this. My biggest fear right now is, I go to all these places, I run into everybody. Everybody is in academia, so they're building a new VR intervention, and they're racing to get their startup going before they've done any of the science. The problem with that is we're going to have all of a sudden where people go, VR is junk because there's too much out of there, and they throw it all away. And as a clinician, I was a clinician for a lot of years. When I first graduated, everybody with back pain got hot packs, electrical stim, and ultrasound, right? Was that the appropriate treatment for back pain? No. Is there use for electrical stim, for heat? Are there things where modalities have some potential? Yeah, but they're almost universally not used because it was overused and not appropriately. So I fear that in VR, that hopefully doesn't all get sort of mishmash about VR is nonsense, it's no good. And again, certainly we're excited with our trial, a large 5-year trial showing the significant positive effects we got with our virtual reality dodgeball. Here is my lab team, and it is consistent of undergraduates, graduates in the DPT program. I have folks from a couple of bioengineers, some folks in psychology, and across the board. So I have this is a year or so old, so my team rotates out pretty quickly, but this is my group. These are my collaborators at VCU, former postdoctoral fellows now. This gentleman here is working for Meta. This gentleman's up in DC at George Washington, and hopefully this woman's going to be joining our staff at VCU. Some colleagues at Ohio University, University of South Florida, University of Florida, and at Northwestern. My funding sources through the NIH, the Osteopathic Heritage Foundation, and the American Osteopathic Association. And I'd like to thank you for your time and patience, and happy to open it up to any questions you may have.
Yeah, we do have some questions that were submitted, but if
Yep.
anyone has any questions right now, please feel free to ask them.
Yeah, so I had one. First of all, Dr. Thomas, that was great. Thank you so much for being here. Well, I was kind of thinking about as you were talking, where do you see this application? Where do you see this growing, 5, 10, maybe 20 years down the road? Do you kind of have a vision for what it could maybe look like?
So what I just presented.
Right.
So
Just
so
VR and the
well, I'll
therapeutic.
start with specifics. So what we're really excited about, I have some couple of young programmers, really clever young folks that just graduated. So we've translated these games now, the whole mover suite, to the Pico Neo 4 system. So that's a standalone system. No, it's affordable. So the Vive system that you saw, all that stuff, it was, they're about 1,500 to 2,000 for the headset. You got to put up base stations. You got to have your computer is probably at least $3,000 to be able to have a high enough graphics card. Now with the standalone headset, it is essentially $500, and you don't need any computer. But the really interesting part, and this is where some of the kids were really clever, is that we have the motion data from the headset and the hands. We're actually, when they put the headset on and start playing, it'll automatically link to a cloud server, and they'll play the game, and all their motion data and any of the response data from that gameplay will be uploaded onto these clouds, de-identified, because it's only the MAC address that does it. But what this allows is, when we start to get to scale, there's two things. One, we can communicate back because we can assess how they played, and then we can start making adjustments in launch velocity, location, so on and so forth. When we start going to scale, right, we're gonna our next trial is going to have 115 people playing the game at home. What happens when you have 1,000 people with the headsets, or 10,000 people, right? Then what you start doing is you start being able to actually really jump into machine learning algorithms, automatically adjusting the parameters to get individuals to engage in a specific target behavior, clinician being able to see what they're doing, like, okay, here, this is the report. You go, wait a second, we need to tweak this a little bit, so that there's ways of doing that, and then look at what behaviors we're all that's the way these are going to go with the games. Remember, I kind of talked about the Goldilocks sweet spot, right? Is the idea, so we can figure out how we can adjust the game in real time to optimize performance. So let's take it away from an orthopedic problem like back pain, although I think it applies to it as well. Is Garrett, I think you were doing some Parkinson's disease work when you were in over the summer when you were there, I think.
Yep, that's right.
And if you folks have treated individuals with PD, right, there's good days and bad days. One, it's a progressive disorder, but within that progressive disorder, there's good days and bad days. So if your PD patient is having a bad day, do you want them not to move? No, you want them to move. You want them to, like, no matter what, if I can only move at half the speed or half the magnitude of motion, it's still better than not moving. Like, not moving is problematic. But if they go to put the headset on, the game is just unplayable because they're having a bad day. Can the game be modified in real time to get them to engage? So that's where I kind of see some of these things, this particular suite going. What we're doing right now is we are rapidly developing a whole series of other types of interventions. So we are working with a pain specialist. We developed VR Guru, which is a virtual reality yoga application. So the clinician can choose what poses they want the participant to do. They put their Android phone, if they have an Android phone right now, we're eventually making for Apple as well, but Apple's a pain. There's a program called Pose, and it can basically read and get the joint angles and the layout of how the person moved, and we can project that movement, their avatar movement, in real time, so that they are basically mimicking the expert in yoga tasks and then trying to figure out how to get better. So there's like the technology is just leapfrogging. And like you said, the idea of being able to grab all of the data and to remotely upload it, and then to also basically have dashboards to communicate. And you guys are I don't know, where are you guys in Alabama? You're not in Birmingham, are you?
I think we're all kind of all over the place. I'm personally in Georgia right now.
So, okay, but if you talk about you're in rural Georgia, Alabama, so on and so forth, one of the great potentials of this technology is to be able to get out to where you may not be able to get to the patient easily. And like the little thing like the pandemics and things like that come up, are we ready to launch?
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, I think we'll get to the questions that were submitted. So the first one's, what kind of virtual reality modality yields the best rehab results or is seen to be the most beneficial?
Yeah, so that's it. Again, it's an overly broad question, but and modality is it? Are we talking about the I think the more immersive. So again, if you can think immersion, we can also think about TV is not immersive, a 3D TV is semi-immersive, and the headsets are completely immersive. And there's going to be variations of that because you can have AR, in which you have sort of like the HoloLens, you have mixed reality headsets. So the question is, it's all going to come back to what are the goals of that. I would suggest that for many cases is that the fully immersive VR headsets are going to be most effective. Now, it may be, like I said, there's some work with Parkinson's disease and freezing. Now, you can't have people walking around with immersed in a fully immersed environment, but you could have them with the HoloLens. That way, give them specific virtual triggers based on, and that's sort of like machine learning of how their head is moving, that they frozen, and then you give them some sort of stimuli based on that. So that's where that goes. I have the questions up in front of me, so I can go through them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
The idea of phantom limb, this is actually a very clever question. And certainly the mirror using the presenting the limb to the individual is trivial with VR. And there's actually a former student of mine, former colleague of mine, Dr. Cross, who is in Texas now, I've been in Alabama for a while, looking at work where they're have the individual, it appears they see their avatar, looks like they're walking, and that has a series of effects on sensation in the legs, so on and so forth. In terms of folks with bilateral amputation, I actually think that would work in reducing phantom limb pain. I don't know that it's been done, but theoretically it should work because you're essentially presenting. Now, the challenge is you're not with one leg gone, you still have normal sensation to the one, and you can see it mirrored over. But that's a really fascinating question, and from a research standpoint, it could be easily testable. But my hunch is that there's a way of making that work. Can virtual reality replace contemporary rehabilitation? Well, I'm sure a lot of people will be not happy if my clinical trial I'm proposing shows that giving someone a headset and playing dodgeball is more effective than standard of care, because we're also going to be doing cost of comparison. It'll be clearly less expensive. I don't think it's going to replace. I think it's going to augment. I think at the end of the day, with all the tools that are available that we want to use, we want to find ways that we can improve outcomes and know that we have a reasonably good chance of doing it based on the data. So I think it's going to change things. I think it's going to allow us to do, I think it's going to be hugely helpful because, again, I'm going to the look back machine, but when I have a patient with back pain and you go, oh, okay, I need them to do extension exercises. So you give, you show them, you give them a little handout, and the patient comes back in and you put them up on the table and say, oh, can you show me your home exercise program? And they start showing you Williams flexing exercise. And you're like, somewhere something got disconnected. Now, if I can have a system that, one, I can track how they did their movements, I can have it prompted and correct, have the system correct, and then as a clinician, I can also, because again, if those data are now being accessible, right, through our dashboards, I can also say, hey, this is fantastic, this looks good, or hey, you really kind of dropped off. You did pretty good for the first weeks, but I'm seeing that you're really not engaging in this behavior, and ideally find clever ways of doing that. So I don't think it's going to replace contemporary rehabilitation, but I think it has great potential to improve. And, for anyone who's treated back pain, there are no answers, right? Like you have someone with back pain come into your office, you rub your hand over them this way. If they don't get better, right? I treated patients full-time for 15 years, back patients. That's why I'm academic, because I had no idea why two patients presenting with the exact same signs and symptoms, applying what I thought was the same treatment, one person gets better, one person gets worse. So again, I think that there's great potential to get more data from these, and as clinicians for us to be able to have greater impact and also be able to reach more patients. Like you said, we find this in urban environments and you find it in rural environments where patients just can't get in to the clinic at the frequency you may desire. And then on top of that, the idea of, are they doing enough repetitions of the exercise that you believe is important to actually affect change? Do I think there's any aspects of rehab that virtuality would not be an asset to? Well, sure. I mean, so, and I'm not just saying this because, the idea of any kind of hand-on manual therapy or osteopathic manual therapy or manual medicine, OMM, I think is what we call it. That is obviously not going to be done. Now, that being said, I published a large clinical trial in JAMA Open comparing muscle energy to manipulation to sham cold laser in chronic low back pain, and there was no difference between the three. So like anything else, sometimes things work, sometimes they don't. But no, it's not going to replace it, not be able to provide joint mobilization or stretches. There are really important things. But if you think about, you have a patient come in, you do, a manipulation of, L4-5 or L3-4, and you're like, oh, this is great, this was stuck. All right, I want you to do this movement like this. Oh, okay, here, have the headset go, and then I'll kind of see how you're doing with it. And we'll do some progression of that, and we'll bring you back in and we'll assess in the future. So again, it's not going to be able to put the hands on the patient. What are some other technologies we use in rehab, especially brain rehab? Well, brain-computer interface is a big thing, but let me step back from there. This is where there's some really clever things going on, because the newer headsets all have eye tracking, right? And once you start being able to have eye tracking, well, then we can start dealing with things like assessing the vestibular ocular reflex. Okay, we can start seeing whether there's a change in gain upregulation or downregulation, the visual versus the vestibular system, we can then start playing with altering optic flow to try to reset that, like you might in the case of Maladé debarkment syndrome. So there's a number of ways where that can work. In terms of my former postdoc is working with TBI and balance, and if there is the Berg balance scale, right? And it's this clever little scale that people use, and it's really good at predicting people's stay in rehab institutes, but it's really poor at predicting falls risk. So she's developed a virtual reality module of this that automatically scores, but it also uses a tracker on the pelvis that then develops a assessment of center of mass displacement, but also looking at higher order variables, the sort of Lyapunov coefficients, to be able to come up with a algorithm to robustly predict falls risk in this assessment tool. So there are things where there's going to be assessment tools and treatment tools that will go along. Like I said, the idea of the brain rehab or the brain computer interface, we will be seeing that, but we'll also be seeing much more of using the VR and the visual stimuli as we get better at developing the tools and the tests to separate out what works and what doesn't. And then finally, the last question is, does VR yield quicker results? Unknown. I mean, it's again, we've just finished this massive clinical trial and on VR dodgeball. And if you'd asked me during, anecdotally, I'd say, wow, this is pretty cool. Everyone's like, people seem to really like this. But I'm not in the lab every day. You know, like I have a lot of people that are running this, and so you never know. But the data is really encouraging. That for certain tasks, this could be a really good intervention. But I think like anything else, you know, it's the idea that if all you've got in your toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so the idea is that, well, from the osteopathic perspective of treating the whole individual, right? You're not treating back pain, you're treating an individual who happens to have back pain, and there's all these other elements, and you're going to pull in different aspects of, are you going to do a muscle energy technique? Are you going to do a high velocity short amplitude manipulation? Are you doing a combination thereof? How are you medicating the individual, and what is the rehabilitation strategy? And so VR is essentially, what I look at it is a tool in the toolbox, and that as we follow the data and the outcomes, hopefully you'll find interventions that are successful, and then we'll build on those, and the ones that aren't, we'll sort of push those aside, but not use it as this panacea of, hey, I can, at one level, I just saw something that Medicare changed their rules on the VR headsets, is that they won't pay for VR. They'll pay for a headset if there's a specific VR software that can be used as an intervention. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's great. The problem is that if everyone says everything they have is an intervention, I think my biggest fear on all of VR is that it's going to be too much too soon, not well tested, and certainly, obviously Zuckerman's pushed all his chips in, and so we'll see how things roll.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. Does anyone have any final questions? If not, I want to say a huge thank you to you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you for answering our questions. Thank you for your time and effort for this presentation and for joining us today. Thank you all for coming, and we shall see you next month. Thank you. Have a good night.